after. Welcome to the World War II Discussion Forum Summer Series of Talks. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I briefly want to cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen as well, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your questions. We'll probably take about 20 or 30 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated, but not expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I mentioned, we are recording this talk for our social media channel, and it will be posted to the YouTube site shortly thereafter. Fourth, and finally, you can send any feedback to the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, and someone I'm thrilled to have. Grant Golub is an assistant professor of American history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. He is an expert on U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy, whose research focuses primarily on American diplomatic, military, and political history and its contemporary relevance. And I have a feeling he's probably very busy today with that scope. However, he is the author of peer-reviewed journal articles in the International History Review and the Journal of Strategic Studies, and his commentary has been published in leading periodicals like the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, National Interest, Real Clear Defense. He is also a non-resident fellow at Defense Priorities, a leading DC foreign policy think tank dedicated to refashioning American grand strategy. He was previously an Ernest May Fellow in History and Policy with the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, his PhD from International History from the LSE, and he also has a master's in history and bachelor's from Princeton. So he's definitely done the circuit. Today, he's going to discuss his first book, Warriors in Washington, Henry Stimson and the U.S. Army and the Politics of American Power in World War II, which details how the U.S. Army inserted itself into the domestic Washington political scene to influence the uses of power during the war. I've read it. It's a fantastic book, very well researched. Just to give you two quick blurbs, Brooke Blower, who spoke for us a while back, writes, Grant's well-researched and deftly written book offers fresh insight into how power worked in Roosevelt's wartime Washington and how, under Henry Stimson's leadership, the U.S. Army mastered the game of backroom angling, vote whipping, and assault by memo. While Jeffrey Engel, who is the director of the Center for Presidential History at SMU, writes, American grand strategy during World War II, and Henry Stimson was the fulcrum. Enmeshed in the highest echelons of power, he more than any other leader put the Army, and thus Army thinking, at the heart of Washington's conception of the world's opportunities and threat. Grant's insightful work gives Stimson his full due, accessible, insightful, well-researched, and well-reasoned. It is a must-read for anyone interested in the rise of the American century. And with that, I will turn it over to Grant.
Thanks so much, Greg. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my book with the World War II Discussion Forum, and I really appreciate all of your time today in coming to listen to me talk about my book. So thank you. As Greg mentioned, I'm here to talk about Warriors in Washington, Henry Stimson, the U.S. Army, and the Politics of American Power in World War II, which I published with Cambridge University Press last year. Before I begin, I just would like to say that nothing I say here represents the views of the U.S. Army War College, the Department of the Army, the Department of War, or the U.S. government. All views here are my own. I can't speak to U.S. policy. I don't represent the administration. And I won't be speaking to any contemporary policy issues during this talk. So I hope everyone understands that. But thank you all again for coming to my talk today. So I want to begin by talking about this idea of the poly crisis and talk about the intertwined present-day challenges that we face as a nation. So especially in the first half of 2026, we've seen continued inflation pressures and economic uncertainty at home and abroad, but we've been dealing with a lot of economic problems, I would argue, over the last 6 years, largely stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic. But if you want to stretch that even further, all the way back to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We're still recovering from a global pandemic, and even though we don't talk about it very much anymore in our national or global public discourse, the world is still trying to move beyond that truly earth-shattering event that killed billions of people. We have an ongoing war on the fringes of Europe in Ukraine. We have ongoing conflict in Iran that seems to not be abating anytime soon. But more broadly, we've had crises in the Middle East over the last few years, going back to Hamas's attack on Israel on October the 7th, 2023. So we have two regions of the world that have been dealing with ongoing war and crises. As a result of both of those conflicts, we've had energy shocks that we've been seeing as we pay at the pump, but we've been dealing with that over the last several years, and a broader energy transition that seemed to be losing steam. I think maybe it's picking up again now as a result of the war in Iran, but broadly speaking, an energy transition to renewables that seemed to be losing steam over the last few years. We've seen the return of great power competition with the People's Republic of China and, of course, with the Russian Federation. Uh, our democracy and our domestic institutions have been facing enormous strains here at home. And last but not least, if that wasn't bad enough, a climate crisis continues to threaten all of humanity. But the interwoven challenges that we face, not only as a nation, but as an international community, I argue require a different type of thinking that breaks down intellectual silos and tackles them in a systemic way. We have to understand the interrelated links between all of the challenges that we're facing from a public policy point of view. But as a nation, we've been in a similar position before. In the late 1930s and during World War II, US policymakers faced potentially existential threats. They faced the possibility of a closed world dominated by hostile forces antithetical to the American way of life, the shattering and weakening of our allies overseas, the freedom of the seas disrupted by our potential enemies, favorable balances of power in Asia and Europe destroyed by the Nazis and the Axis powers, and ultimately dangers to the political, economic, and territorial integrity of the United States. So, up until this point, the US Army and the American military establishment had largely focused on more limited issues and eschewed most areas of national policymaking. It battled our nation's enemies during wartime, but otherwise concerned itself with fighting Native Americans and preserving US continental security. But faced with hazards unlike any it had ever seen, the Army shifted its thinking, it globalized its thinking and how it approached U.S. national security problems by inserting itself into new areas of policy formation and examining the dilemmas confronting Washington as part of one overarching crisis. So, this idea of the poly crisis. So my book sort of starts to tackle all of that. It looks at how American institutions and domestic politics influence U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy, and especially the armed forces and executive branch agencies. The book more specifically explores how the War Department and the U.S. Army operated as a bureaucratic political and policy actor within the politics of wartime Washington during World War II, focusing on the role of Henry Stimson, who you can see on the photo on the left-hand side, as Secretary of War. And the question or the puzzle that I was really interested in trying to figure out and to answer is, why did the Army and the military more broadly gain unprecedented levels of influence over national policy under a president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was renowned for centralizing authority and decision making in his own hands? And my conclusion in the book is that the War Department emerged as a pivotal policymaking nexus within the US government because its senior civilian officials, led by Stimson, transformed it into a political actor which actively worked to influence the bureaucratic and political decision-making processes. And so specifically, my book uses Stimson as a lens to examine the War Department as a bureaucratic, political, and policy operator in Washington during the war years. And what's interesting about Stimson, I'd like to note really right off the top here, is unlike most US cabinet officials, both at the time and during American history, broadly speaking, Stimson was unusual in the sense that he was a hands-on leader who played a really significant role in all of his department's core activities, but he also possessed unrivaled government experience, and I'll get a little more into that in a second. But for the purposes of my book, I argue that this allowed him to raise the Army's political stature in Washington and makes him a valuable perch from which to assess how the War Department behaved in our nation's capital and in the policymaking process. Okay, so how did the War Department refit itself to function as a bureaucratic government operator and attempt to move from the fringes to the center of U.S. government power? So let me talk a little bit more about Stimson's background and experience. He was born and raised in New York and became a corporate lawyer representing some of our nation's biggest companies at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. His first position in public life was as a U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, prosecutors in the United States. And he did that for about 5 years under Teddy Roosevelt. He then became the Secretary of War for the first time in the years before World War I under William Howard Taft. He then later in the 1920s became the Governor General of the Philippines under Calvin Coolidge when the Philippines was still at this time an American protectorate. And he also was Calvin Coolidge's personal envoy to the warring parties in the Nicaraguan Civil War in 1927 and helped resolve that crisis. And finally, he became Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover. So by the 1930s, he's a highly respected Republican Party statesman with decades of experience at the highest levels of government, whose views were taken seriously by both U.S. elites, those in Washington and New York and the other power centers of our nation, and the wider public. And I want to stress the wider public as well, because he was very well known amongst the American population and amongst the American populace as someone who really spoke for a variety of administrations and was very prominent on a number of public policy issues. So during World War II, right, he comes in with all this experience and he sets about trying to move the War Department from the fringes to the center of U.S. government power. And the different ways that Stimson and his top lieutenants do that is that they streamline their bureaucracy within the War Department, which had been an absolute mess under decades of neglect, and improve civil-military relations within the Army to craft a coherent political and policy agenda. Him and his lieutenants cultivated relationships with key executive branch officials and legislators to build coalitions in support of the Army's policy initiatives. And finally, Stimson and his lieutenants inserted the Army into political conversations and decision-making processes it previously was not involved in to ensure the Army's interests were met. And the result, I argue in the book, was that the Army gained important leverage over its bureaucratic rivals, namely the Navy and the State Departments, which helped it drive the political and policy conversations within the executive branch. So Stimson and his advisors had a concrete policy and agenda that was independent of the White House, and they employed the tools at their disposal to enact it and influence domestic politics and Roosevelt administration policy. So these are broadly the tools that they're trying to use to move the Army into the center of those decision-making processes. But what does this all mean for the Army as it confronted the poly crisis of the 1940s? So the War Department, as I was sort of previously alluding to, was previously very dysfunctional and disorganized under Stimson's immediate predecessors during the 1930s. Stimson's immediate predecessor as Secretary of War was this man named Harry Woodring, who was sort of this affable former Midwestern governor of Kansas, who really believed in a limited sense of U.S. security and was really more focused on preserving continental security, had a very, very limited sense of America's security perimeter. And his deputy, Lewis Johnson, who eventually becomes Secretary of Defense under Harry Truman, was a very brash East Coast internationalist who had been the former head of the American Legion, one of the country's largest veterans organizations, and he had a very expansive sense of U.S. national security, thought the United States should really be the bedrock of global power and the international order, and he was constantly gunning for Harry Woodring's job. He was constantly pushing Roosevelt to fire Harry Woodring and allow Johnson to take over as Secretary of War. So you have a personal and a professional and a policy clash at the top of the War Department that helped make it extremely dysfunctional and disorganized. But this also impacted the state of civil military relations in the Army, as it really prevented key Army leaders, especially U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, who becomes the Chief of Staff on September 1st, 1939, which is the same day that the Nazis invade Poland, and really did not allow them to get on with the work of keeping the Army in a sharp state of readiness to protect the nation and confront the nation's enemies. So the top of the War Department, both on the civilian and the military side, is extremely dysfunctional and disorganized. So Stimson comes in and he brings in a circle, a team of competent, like-minded officials, people like John J. McCloy, Robert Lovett, Harvey Bundy, who was the father of McGeorge Bundy, who became later the National Security Advisor to John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. He brings people like that in, people who were very competent, who had a lot of either rich private sector or government experience to try and sort out the bureaucratic morass that had existed under Stimson's immediate predecessors. So he brings these folks in, and Stimson really goes to work on cultivating George Marshall and ensuring that there's a steady, stable, predictable relationship between him and Marshall to bring both sides of the Army, the civilian side and the military side, into harmony, into a state of accord, so that they can help make the Army a more potent and organized bureaucratic operator, and also do what it's there to do, which is fight the nation's enemies and win the nation's wars. And one of the ways that they try to bring both sides of the Army into a state of harmony is by coordinating weekly between civilian and military officials with weekly war council meetings, which brings both sides of the Army onto the same page, and allows the top officials to make sure that everyone's kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. And they would have those offices, those meetings in Stimson's office, which was adjoining George Marshall's. So beyond that, Stimson brought in a series of specific reforms in order to reorganize and refit the War Department. So I already talked about the Woodring-Johnson rivalry that had made the War Department so bureaucratically ineffective. But part of the reason that this rivalry had so impacted the War Department was because under U.S. law, the Assistant Secretary of War, who was the #2 official in the War Department at the time, had independent powers of the Secretary of War that meant that the Assistant Secretary didn't answer to the Secretary of War, especially on issues of procurement and readiness and munitions production. And so this allowed Lewis Johnson, to form an independent power base from Harry Woodring. And so this created a lot of personal or professional clashes, or exacerbated those personal and professional clashes. So Stimson convinces Congress to change the law to remove the Assistant Secretary of War's independent powers. And they create a new Undersecretary of War position that will directly answer to the Secretary of War. And the idea behind this, as I'm sure you can imagine, is to make sure that all political and bureaucratic power flows out of the Secretary of the War's office. The Secretary of War will delegate to his top officials, but he holds all of that power in law and legislatively. And so he can give power to people, but he can also take it away. There's no independent power centers within the War Department. And they changed that law in December of 1940, and Robert Patterson becomes the Undersecretary of War. This was another one of those officials that Stimson brings in the summer of 1940, when he becomes Secretary of War the second time under Franklin Roosevelt. And they create this new Undersecretary of War position, and Robert Patterson takes that up and is in that position for the remainder of World War II. Looking beyond the Army itself, Stimson's also instrumental in creating an organization called the Cabinet Defense Council, in which the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Navy would meet weekly to coordinate foreign and defense policy matters as the president's top civilian foreign policy advisors, and ensure that all three of these departments were speaking with one voice to the President of the United States. So these were weekly meetings between Henry Stimson, Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, and Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy. And they superseded the Cabinet Defense Council over these other committees like the State War Navy Liaison Committee to make sure that the final word on a number of important national security issues was coming from the CDC before it would go to the president, right? And the idea here is that the committee helps put the Army into a more prominent policy role. And part of the reason why the Army was able to get in that position with the creation of the Cabinet Defense Council was because the Stimson-Marshall partnership gave Stimson greater insight into other areas of policymaking than his counterparts enjoyed, because Marshall was sort of acting on the military side as the Secretary of War's eyes and ears. And so this helped Stimson drive the council's agenda and recommendations and helped increase War Department leverage over Navy and state, because what happened was that those departments were coming to the Army for access and information. The Navy's top officials, Frank Knox and later James Forrestal, and the Chief of Naval Operations, Betty Stark, and then Frank or Ernest King, excuse me, they didn't have that same kind of relationship. And the State Department sort of decided to wall itself off from a lot of wartime political and policy issues and focus on post-war planning. So this really put the Army in a central position to drive a lot of the agenda, not only on the Cabinet Defense Council, but a lot of the foreign policy conversations that are happening in the Roosevelt administration in the lead up to the Pearl Harbor attacks, and then once the United States is actually in the war. And last but not least, Stimson decides to institute weekly press conferences to shape the public narrative about U.S. foreign policy and later the war effort. And the way that he does this, or one of the ways he does this, is by cultivating a wide network of reporters and journalists to help increase the Army's stature and political standing. And the idea here was that positive press coverage was key to expanding and strengthening the War Department's political influence in Washington, because it helped the Army build public support for its policy objectives. Leading newspapers would often dedicate column inches to covering Stimson's press briefings and would help deliver the Army's message on important wartime political and policy issues. And that was something that really stunned me when I was doing the research for this book, because they would often print these press briefings verbatim in very prominent places in leading newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. They didn't even do that for the president most of the time. So they would always cover the president's press conferences, of which Roosevelt would give them twice a week usually. But they weren't printing what the president was saying verbatim most of the time. But they often did that with Stimson, which I found quite striking. So to sort of see all of this in action, I wanted to talk about an example, which was the War Department's lobbying for the Selective Service Act in the summer of 1940. And this was the first peacetime draft in American history, and how essentially the Army becomes internal government lobbyists for its own policy objectives, right? Because they really supported the Selective Service Act because there was a recognition that the Army was severely undermanned and they needed personnel. They needed men, they needed bodies in order to fulfill all of the roles that Congress was giving to the Army and to the military in the wake of the fall of France and the collapse of Western Europe in the spring and early summer of 1940. And so the Army is really pushing Roosevelt to adopt its views despite his political reluctance to get behind a draft in an election year. You have to remember that Roosevelt is running for an unprecedented third term as president, and he doesn't want to upset the proverbial apple cart, right? So he's reluctant to get behind this issue, and so the Army is steadily pushing him internally to come out openly in support of conscription, right? So Stimson helped build and work with an outside coalition to push conscription by acting as sort of an internal advocate who could muster the vast political network that he had built up over a number of decades in Washington and the bureaucratic skills he had to push Congress and the president to back a military draft. So he's meeting with legislators, he's testifying on Capitol Hill, he's privately and publicly pushing Roosevelt to help enact the draft. And in terms of this sort of lobbying operation that the Army is setting up, They're keeping very detailed notes on congressmen and senators, thinking about, okay, this person is fully in support of a draft, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on them. We have a Democrat from Maryland, let's say, I'm just making up an example, but we have a Democrat from Maryland, let's say, who's a holdout, so maybe a personal call from the president will push that guy over the line. We've got a Republican from Michigan who needs a little more of a push, so maybe we can throw some money to his reelection bid, and that will get him to support conscription. We got a guy from Nebraska who says he will never support this no matter what, so let's not waste any time on him. And so this very detailed vote whipping operation that the Army is leading, or the War Department is leading under Stimson's stewardship, was really sophisticated for this period and really in depth in the amount of politicking that is going on behind the scenes that the Army is heavily involved in. It's not just Stimson, it's his key lieutenants, it's George Marshall. You have senior Army officers also involved in this process, including helping write drafts of this legislation at Stimson's private Washington home, Woodley Mansion. So you really see them getting involved in the political side of this in order to get conscription over the line. And all of this helps lead to the passing of the first peacetime draft in American history, which Roosevelt, you can see in the photo, is signing, which he does on September 16th, 1940. And this is an early example of the transformation of the Army's place in the political and policy process. So what does this all mean? What are the main takeaways from this book and this research? So the first thing I want to talk about is how the Army emerges as a significant U.S. policymaking actor within the executive branch and in Washington. By the end of World War II, the Army had firmly moved to the center of U.S. government power and influence, right? So one of the natural rejoinders to that be, well, we're fighting a global war, we're amassing the world's largest land force ever seen. We have over 8 million men under arms, at least in American history. Of course, the Army is going to get more involved. And that's true. But we had fought a world war only 20 years before, and you don't see the Army moving into the center of government decision making in the same way. And you don't see the concrete political push to get the Army involved in all of that type of decision making and policy making. And so the Army and the military are now involved in a bunch of decision and policy making processes across a range of foreign policy and national security issues it previously had little interaction with or leverage over. So this new way of thinking about addressing the issues of the day, the policy crisis of the day, really puts the Army in the center of U.S. government decision making, and it emerges as a crucial U.S. policy making actor. So by inserting itself into American domestic politics, the Army had become an important component of the domestic political establishment and a fixture in American society. Before World War II, the Army and the military had largely stood removed from the daily currents of American politics and culture, and now that's very much not the case. It's very much the opposite case that's going on here as a result of the Stimson-led War Department during World War II. So now the relationship between politicians and Army and military officers becomes much more entangled, and military leaders are seen by the public and by those in Washington as trustworthy and reliable voices on critical political and policy issues. It's important to remember that the grand strategy formulation does not happen in a domestic political vacuum, right? This process occurs against a backdrop of contending pressures, clashing ideologies, and various actors' divergent policy objectives. So to understand how American grand strategy is created, we have to grasp how various stakeholders conceptualize our national interests and try to shape the means the country uses to meet them. And that's very much what the Army is doing here in these years. So my research helps us understand that and builds on various theoretical models designed to explain how public policy is crafted, such as the bureaucratic politics approach, with tangible and applied historical evidence that can be used to address contemporary policymaking to discern how the domestic political environment impacts national security policy and strategy. And last but not least, the Army and the military really becomes a cornerstone of the post-war national security state. The creation of the new institutions and organizations after World War II that transforms the relationship between diplomacy and the use of force, and ultimately how national security policy is formulated, is crucial in the development of our American government. And it leads to an integration of US policy instruments and tools in a systemic way for achieving national ends, which had been previously absent from most exercises of American statecraft. And the Army is very much leading the way in creating this new type of US foreign policy making. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Grant. That was wonderful. I think everyone knows the instructions, so please use the raise hand feature or type your question in the chat, and I'll read out your questions or unmute your line. First one from David. Please comment on the War Department's and Army's efforts, both during World War II and post-war, to curtail the size, role, and missions of the U.S. Marine Corps.
That's a good question. It's interesting because as you guys know, I work at the U.S. Army War College, and my students are and my Marine colleagues are sort of constantly joking about how the Marine Corps is kind of always fighting for its existence, right? Um, and there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, they joke around about it, but like it's true because there's a view within several corners of the military establishment that the Marine Corps, which is about 6 to 8% of our annual defense budget, is spent on the Marine Corps, is not really needed. And those resources can be better invested elsewhere. And of course, you're in the Army, you probably think it's better in the Army. Um, and so during World War II, you sort of have that dynamic as well. And the Marine Corps, of course, is very heavily involved in the Pacific War, which is very much a naval and Army Air Forces front, given the nature of the geography of the Pacific, right? So you have the Army too, but they're mostly focused on like the Southwest Pacific. And so you have those clashes, but because of the nature of the conflict, the divergent approaches and the inter-service rivalry that I think we've all sort of come to expect within our military and was certainly present in the interwar period between World War I and World War II is put to one side in terms of the shape of the armed forces because they're busy fighting over other things like how best to actually win the war, the supremacy of whether Germany should be defeated first or Japan should be defeated first, and trying to allocate resources accordingly. So the Marine Corps sort of gets a respite from those fights over the nature of its existence. And as we know, of course, the Marine Corps still exists today. So they're still fighting that fight. But it's not as prominent of a inter-service issue as it is during other periods in American history.
Next question from Charles. How much did the Korean War have to do with the emergence of the Army as a crucial U.S. policy-making actor?
Um, I think the way that the Korean War, excuse me, is initially fought very much has a lot to deal with this. The outbreak of the war doesn't have anything to do with that, right? I mean, the North Koreans invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950, in a surprise attack that completely caught the U.S. government off guard. And we know that the North Koreans have been pushing for an invasion of the South for at least 2 years before the actual war begins in the summer of 1950. But appointing Douglas MacArthur, right, who had been essentially the de facto emperor of Japan since the end of World War II, right? He was leading Japan as the head of as the sort of supreme commander of the Allied powers in World War II. He appointing him as the head of United Nations Command and U.S. forces in Korea gives the Army very wide latitude over the way the war is fought. And you sort of have that disconnect between the U.S. military strategy and the shifting political objectives of the Truman administration. And because of MacArthur's stature as one of the celebrated commanders of U.S. military forces from World War II, but also the entire career he had before that, being a former Army Chief of Staff as well. Senior U.S. commanders and officials in Washington, people like George Marshall, or even President Truman, at least until he fires MacArthur, are very reluctant to get in MacArthur's face and tell him what to do because they know that MacArthur is so celebrated and because there are concerns that MacArthur might publicly speak out against the administration, which he then later does, and then try to run for president, which he sort of done in 1948, right? And to some extent in 1944, or at least he wasn't clamping down the idea of people drafting him to running for the Republican nomination, including, like I said, in 1944, when he's actually fighting World War II in the Pacific. So I think people were very reluctant to get in his face, and this really helped increase the Army's power after he's fired. And then you have Matthew Ridgway and then Mark Clark as those senior commanders. That relationship is much better, but it does put the Army in a very prominent position to really play an outsized role over the military strategy of the conflict, and it also helps that it's a land war, right? And so that plays a big role in that too.
Next question, how did the OWI interact with the actions of Stimson? Was there an effort to control information, specifically referring to curtailing all information on the Katyn massacre of June 43?
Yeah, there was a lot of press censorship during the war. And the Office of War Information, the OWI, played a prominent role in that, but so did the military's press censors. And journalists were more or less willing to sort of comply with those things because they understood the nature of the fighting and how that might impact the ability of the Allies to wage successful war against the Axis powers. So the Army sort of plays a big role in trying to censor information, especially information that might damage the Allied fight, quite considerably. And so the Army does play a pretty prominent, I don't talk about it very much in my book, but the Army does play a very prominent role in trying to censor that type of information and working with organizations like the OWI.
Okay, I'm going to take a few from the queue with the raised hands. Gary, if you want to unmute your line, and then Mike, I'll go to you. Gary, are you able to unmute your line?
Yeah, I thought I hit the mute button, but I guess can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay. Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'll just say that often in the past, I try to buy the book in advance for these sessions, and in your case, I saw the price tag and hesitated, but
I
during the
understand.
presentation, I went ahead and bought it. So
Thank
that's
you.
the highest compliment, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much.
So as you know, Stimson was a very strong advocate for Operation Sledgehammer,
Yep.
which, by the way, in the winter 2026 issue of the Naval War College Review, there's an article authored by me on Operation Sledgehammer, which I think brings some new information to the table. So you might be interested in downloading that.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely.
But something I didn't touch on in that article at all because you'd have limited space. But it does seem to, it seems pretty clear that his strong advocacy for Sledgehammer, including after the July meetings, after the decision for torch had been made for some period of time, somewhat, damaged his relationship with Roosevelt for some period of time.
Yep.
And that he was kind of in the outs. And then I do remember, I believe from his, quite a while ago, I read a fair bit of his diary, Stimson's diary. And at some point prior to Tehran, he's now enthusiastic. He feels like he's got the president's ear again. Got the president on his side.
Yep.
And also, I'm just going to throw one other thing in there. Maybe you have some perspectives on this with respect to Marshall, which I heard someone a couple of years ago say, Marshall actually only met one-on-one with Roosevelt like once or twice during the entire war, which like King met with him privately all the time. So
Yep.
I'm just going to throw that in there. But what do you think? Because obviously at Tehran, Roosevelt was was sold on now we're going to push the British into a cross channel invasion no matter what. That's my perspective, and I believe that in certain respects he felt bucked up by Stalin in that respect. But anyway, what do you think transpired in Roosevelt's thinking? I mean, that obviously is a very difficult question, I feel
Yeah.
like. But
Yeah.
what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So I appreciate you asking it, Gary. So after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's he has two political objectives that he needs to accomplish in his mind. One is that he needs to get American forces fighting the Germans. He needs to get them in action as quickly as possible. That's number one. And number two, he needs to manage his new Soviet allies, right? Now that we're actually fighting the war. I mean, we had sort of begun a burgeoning collaboration in the 6 months before Pearl Harbor, with the launching of Operation Barbarossa, right, which is the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the United States starts sending material and munitions and supplies to the Russians via Lend-Lease in order to support them on the Eastern Front once they realize that the Russians are not going to quickly collapse like they had estimated beforehand. So he needs to satiate Stalin, and he also needs to get the Americans fighting the Germans. Because the Japanese had attacked us, there was overwhelming public sentiment that Japan was the biggest enemy of the United States and they must be defeated first. And so, in order to manage that that tension between Roosevelt's conception of Germany being the most important enemy and the public clamoring for us to take the war to the Japanese, he needs to solve this political problem of getting the American troops into action against the Germans and have the American people see that happening. So these are the twin political goals he has. So in the winter and the spring and the summer of 1942, they're trying to figure out where the big first American military action is going to be. And as you rightfully pointed out, Stimson and the Army are pushing for a limited military invasion of northwestern Europe, preferably in France, which is going to be called Operation Roundup, which was sort of scheduled for the spring of 1943, and they would use the British Isles as a base from which that would take place. But if they felt that the Germans were either weakening before that as a result of the conflict on the Eastern Front, or that the Russians might be looking like they might capitulate, they would authorize, right, a six-division attack on the French coast called Operation Sledgehammer, which would happen maybe in the fall of 1942. But the problem with that, one of the problems with that, is that because American forces had not really been mobilized, and because a lot of resources were going into the Pacific just to stem the tremendous Allied losses as a result of Japan's attacks not only on Pearl Harbor but simultaneous attacks throughout the Pacific, the southeastern Pacific. The Americans don't have the men, the resources, the material, the landing craft to actually mount even a sledgehammer type of invasion, right? So they're going to be pretty reliant on the British to actually furnish a lot of those resources. And the British, who sort of are hemming and hawing throughout this whole period about the wisdom of this type of attack, ultimately say we're not gonna do it, right? So, what is Roosevelt? What can he do in that instance if he can't get his British allies to actually agree to this? He can't get Winston Churchill to agree to this. He's kind of in a political he's between a political rock and a hard place. And at the same time, Stalin and the Russians are putting a lot of pressure on the United States and the British to do something. And so, because the army wasn't giving Roosevelt the political answer at the end of the day that he needed, Roosevelt first thought that they were, and then when the British were being too obstinate, he felt differently. He decides, okay, we're just going to go for Operation Torch, and he kind of subverts the whole policy process that had been happening over the previous 6 months and says, we're going for Torch. It needs to be launched no later than October 30th, and that's what we're doing, and this is going to solve my problems. And eventually it gets pushed like a week and a half later, and so it happens in November of 1942. But he's sort of able to massage this with the Russians, even though this isn't really the second front that Stalin had in mind. But at least he's getting American forces into battle against the Germans in a serious and substantive way in his mind, and this helps solve his political problem. So because they have U.S. and British forces in North Africa as a result of the successful torch landings in November 1942. When they're debating what to do next, and they're going to meet at Casablanca, the Joint Chiefs of Staff admit, and I talk about this in my book, that they can't really do anything else other than further operations in the Mediterranean theater because they still have the material problem. They still have the manpower shortages. They're still dealing with the Japanese in the Pacific. And so they kind of acquiesce to further Mediterranean operations because they don't really have an alternative. So they agree to the invasion of Sicily, which becomes known as Operation Husky, in the summer of 1943. And then they'll kind of see where things go from there. But there wasn't really much of a debate about whether they would, okay, shut down the Mediterranean theater and now shift all of the forces to the British Isles, or continue with Mediterranean operations, because all of the Joint Chiefs recognized that they weren't really going to be able to do that. So the real debate was between whether we continue to pump resources into the Mediterranean to try and knock the Italians out of the war or further damage the Germans in order to help the Russians on the Eastern Front, or we shift more of those resources to the Pacific theater, which the top naval chiefs, Ernest King and William Leahy are really pushing for, because they think that's where the real war is, right? They think that Japan first is the way to go, and that's also really, like I said earlier, a naval war. So Casablanca, they settle for Operation Husky, but it's in this period, right, between Casablanca, the Trident Conference in May of 1943, and the Quadrant Conference in Quebec in August 1943, in preparation for Tehran in November of 1943, that the army starts to, okay, what can we do to learn from our failures in the policy process in 1942, and how can we push the president to get back on our side? And this is where they really take control of the policymaking process, or the machinery of the policymaking process, and they vociferously attack British military strategy as really just designed to protect the British Empire and ensure its post-war imperial uh, access to various parts of the world. And they put a more political emphasis on trying to convince the president of the wisdom of the U.S. point of view on these military questions. And I think as a result of those interventions, by the Trident Conference in Washington in May of 1943, you see Roosevelt starting to come around to their point of view, in part because he sees the British as being obstinate, and the British are now causing political problems for him because the military action that they're advocating for is not going to help Roosevelt with the Russian problem. It's not going to help him satiate Stalin. It's not going to help him keep the Russians on side, right? Which he needs in order to keep supporting the Eastern Front, but he also needs, because he's thinking already about the post-World War II world once the fighting stops, and he needs Stalin's support and acquiescence to Roosevelt's ideas of what the post-war international order would look like. And so this is where then he starts coming down hard on the British to get them to the sort of the army's point of view. And then when you get to Tehran in November of 1943, Stalin, puts the kibosh on the whole thing and says, this has to happen, and it's got to happen in France, and it's got to happen in the next 6 months. And so that is the exclamation point on a very long, dragged out process. But you have to have all of that bureaucratic wrangling and infighting between the Army and the Navy, between the Americans and the British to get to that point, because Stalin is able to throw his weight behind Roosevelt's ideas, put Churchill in a corner, and get them to ultimately commit to Overlord in June of 1943. 44. But the Army is playing a really prominent role in building up to that point and really leading the way in a lot of those debates, at least on the American side. And that's what I argue in my book. I've got about 2 chapters on these questions. So it's a really great topic, really great set of policy and military strategy issues. So I appreciate the question, Gary. Thank you.
Great.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Excellent talk. I have 2 questions. The first one has to do with, sorry, I hope you can keep track of them.
That's okay.
I wonder if you can address within the Army, of course, you had the United States Army Air Corps, later becoming the United States Army Air Force. And I was wondering, because it was almost treated to a large degree almost as a separate service. And I was wondering if you could say what his feelings and maneuverings were about that. I do know that that at least at the beginning of the war, you usually had to volunteer. In other words, if you were drafted, you were not drafted into the Army Air Corps. You had to volunteer for that. That, of course, became a little murkier as time went on. But I was wondering what were the maneuverings, what was happening concerning the ever-growing United States Army Air Corps within the Army, of course, still part of the Army. And the second question would be, because you did touch on his dealings with Britain and Soviet Union, but within the Commonwealth, countries like Canada and Australia, there was some maneuvering as to how much autonomy they would have, or even attachment, certainly with Australia, but also with Canada, there was a lot of maneuvering as to how much autonomy or how much more on the side of the United States, or that they would be. There was one force, the First Special Service Force, that was a joint Canadian-American force. But I was wondering what his feelings were, or if he was involved in that in any way. I hope that's clear. Sorry if it wasn't.
No, absolutely, it's clear. Yeah, no, thank you for the questions. So the first question about the Army Air Forces, as you allude to, right? So it's the Army Air Corps, and then it becomes the Army Air Forces before they become the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947. During the interwar period, there is increasing clamoring amongst the Army Air Corps' senior commanders about splitting off from the ground force command structures and becoming an independent branch of the United States military. The most senior leaders of the U.S. Army are able to sort of keep that at bay, but it's becoming increasingly difficult because of all the political pressure that the Air Force or the Air Forces Corps, whatever, commanders are putting on their leadership, and also trying to use Congress to get this to happen. And so, in addition to the inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy, you have intra-rivalry within the Army itself over these questions. When World War II rolls around to the United States and the United States actually starts fighting, those questions are temporarily put to one side. And part of the way this happens is by putting Henry Arnold, who was at the beginning of the war a 3-star general, as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So Arnold, the original Joint Chiefs, there's 3, right? There's George Marshall, there's the Chief of Naval Operations, which is at first Harold Stark, and then becomes Ernest King. And there's Henry Arnold. Then a 4th is added when Ernest King becomes Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. And then there's a 5th when William Leahy becomes Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief. Stark is actually removed as Chief of Naval Operations, and then King operates as both the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and the Chief of Naval Operations. So then you have 4. But for a while, the Army was outnumbering the Navy, and the Army was more focused on trying to beat the Navy in terms of its conception of U.S. national interest, in terms of the way the war should be fought, in terms of the way that the allocation of material and resources should favor the services. And so they're more focused on that inter-service rivalry. But I think, as you rightfully point out, as the war drags on and the Army Air Forces become more and more powerful, those questions about whether there should be an independent U.S. Air Force start to rise to the surface again. Stimson's way of managing this during the war was by creating an Assistant Secretary of War for Air, and that was Robert Lovett's position. And so he worked very closely with Henry Arnold in order for them to coordinate on all issues of air forces to make sure that the air forces felt like they were being taken care of. But it's not until actually really until the end of the war when those questions about the future organization of the U.S. military after the conclusion of hostilities comes about, that you really start to get this political pressure again to create an independent Air Force. And Henry Arnold, right, who becomes the first chief of staff of the Air Force, and eventually a 4-star general and then a 5-star. He's really him, and those senior Air Forces commanders are really, like people like Curtis LeMay and Carl Spaatz, are really pushing for this quite heavily. So it's not really right until you get the National Security Act of 1947 that you have the creation of an independent U.S. Air Force. But they're able to sort of clamp down on that issue during the war because they've got bigger fish to fry. But as soon as the war's over, those political battles and those inter-service or intra-service issues are coming back to the floor again. So that's the first question. Second question, Stimson doesn't really have a lot of, I think, management of the sort of the dominion parts of the British Empire, right? You're thinking about things like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. He's not, he really focuses more on dealing with the British and dealing with Churchill and top British military commanders. He is not so much involved in dealing with the Canadians or the Australians or the New Zealanders or the South Africans, or the Indians for that much. It's sort of all kind of done under the British flag, and so he's not really getting too involved in those matters. But thank you for the questions.
That's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. We got one more in the queue. This is from how was General Basile, head of G2, viewed by the Secretary of War since he originally was just number 2?
I don't really talk about that in my book very much, but G2 does play a huge role in providing information and intelligence to senior Army commanders and to Stimson on a variety of matters. And the information that they're providing does really inform a lot of the early views that Stimson and his lieutenants take on key policy issues, especially dealing with the Russians and the sort of potential shape of the post-war international order, dealing with Russian intentions and capabilities and that type of stuff. So, and Stimson gets memos directly from G2. In addition to Marshall, it's not just something that uniformed military officers or generals are getting. So there is a tightness in that relationship, and the senior civilians are getting that information as well.
Perfect. That concludes our talk for today. Again, the book is Warriors in Washington, Henry Stimson, the U.S. Army, and the Politics of American Power in World War II by Grant Golub. Thank you for a great talk and Q&A. Please join us next Saturday, July 18th at 1 p.m. when historian John Parshall will discuss his latest book, 1942, Crux of War. Thanks again to the audience, and thanks again to our speaker for a great talk.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for all the great questions, and I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture. So thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.